If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I prepared especially for you. The wagon didn't stop for long. The driver barely looked at her when he said, "End of the line, ma'am," and flicked the reins. The horse started forward before she could answer. The wheels cut a shallow track in the thin snow, and the sound faded into the trees until only wind remained. Clara Vance stood still for a moment, her gloved hand holding a small bundle of belongings. A few clothes, a shawl, a tin cup, a Bible she didn't read anymore. She watched the wagon shrink into the distance, its shape swallowed by the slope of the trail. The cold air scraped her throat when she swallowed. Behind her lay 2 days of travel from the settlement that no longer wanted her. Ahead, a valley stretched toward a ridge of dark stone and pine where smoke lifted faintly into the gray sky. They told her that was where the man lived. Elias Boone, a former cavalry scout, now a trapper, alone since the war ended. She had heard rumors before coming. He kept to himself, barely came to town, sometimes traded pelts for salt and flour, spoke few words, and didn't take kindly to visitors. The councilman who exiled her said he could use help keeping his cabin. What they meant was that no one else wanted to live near her. She pulled her coat tighter and started walking. The trail was uneven, half buried in frost, marked by animal tracks. Each breath came in slow clouds that rose and disappeared before her eyes. Her boots, thin-soled and cracked, let the cold bite through. She kept her eyes on the smoke column. It was the only sign of life in the white-gray landscape. Her thoughts circled the same few things: the town, her husband, the judgment. The whispers started after his death. Some said she pushed him, others said she poisoned him. No one had proved anything, but proof didn't matter in a place that needed a villain to keep its order. When the pastor called her unfortunate, it sounded worse than guilty. They didn't hang her. They just sent her away. By the time she reached the cabin, her hands burned from the cold and her feet were half numb. It was a low structure of pine logs, rough-hewn but solid, a thin column of smoke rising from the chimney. The sound of an axe echoed from behind the cabin. She stopped at the edge of the yard, snow crunching under her boots, and waited. The man came into view, broad-shouldered and tall, coat patched at the elbows, beard grown thick against the cold. His hair was streaked with gray at the edges, his face half hidden under a fur cap. He looked at her once, and then at the empty road behind her. "You're the one they sent," he said. His voice was low, even the kind of tone that didn't expect an answer. "I'm Clara Vance," she said, trying to steady her breath. He nodded once. "Elias Boone." He leaned the axe against the woodpile and walked toward the cabin door. "You can come in." Inside, it was warmer. The air smelled of pine smoke and animal hide. A small fire burned steady in the stone hearth. There was a table with 2 mismatched chairs, a cot against the back wall, a few iron pans hanging by hooks. Everything was clean but worn. He took off his gloves and set them near the fire to dry. "Council said you needed a place," he said, "and I needed someone to keep the roof from falling in." Clara kept her eyes on the fire. "I can do that," she said quietly. He nodded again, still not looking at her. "You can take the cot near the wall. It leaks when the wind turns east, but I'll fix it when I get the time." She hesitated before asking, "Do you want me to cook tonight?" "Beans and salt pork. There's coffee if you're careful with it." He didn't say more. She took that as permission. While she unpacked her small bundle, one change of clothes, a comb, a spool of thread, she felt his eyes on her for a moment, then heard the door open and close. Through the window, she saw him walk back into the yard and split wood until the last of the daylight disappeared. When he came back inside, she had the fire built up and the pot simmering. The smell filled the cabin, sharp and familiar, and for a brief second she remembered what it felt like to be safe inside a warm room. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft clink of tin spoons against the bowls. He ate slow, methodical, like a man who measured every bite. When the food was gone, he said, "Town told me what happened." She didn't look up. "They told you their side." He studied her for a long moment, then said, "Don't matter to me." The words didn't sound kind, but they weren't cruel either. They sounded like fact. Afterward, he sat near the hearth with a mug of coffee, while she folded her shawl and laid it at the foot of the cot. She didn't know if she should speak again or keep quiet, so she said nothing. Her hands shook when she untied her boots. It wasn't from cold anymore. It was from the sudden exhaustion that hit after days of fear and waiting. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, making the boards creak. She listened to it, and for the first time in months, no one was shouting, no one was calling her a curse. Just the fire, the wind, and a man who didn't ask for her story. Elias Boone sat at the table, staring at the flames. He had seen people come and go from his life, most leaving by death. He hadn't planned on anyone staying again. The council had offered him supplies in return for taking her in, and he agreed because winter made trade hard. That was the reason he gave himself. But watching her now, small, tired, still standing despite everything, he understood that survival wasn't only about food and shelter. When she finally lay down, the cot creaked softly. He poured the last of the coffee into his mug and muttered, "You'll get used to the quiet." From the corner, her voice came low and certain. "I already am." He looked toward her shadow on the wall, then back at the fire. For the first time in years, he didn't mind the sound of another person breathing under his roof. The morning came pale and slow, a gray light crawling through the cracks in the window. Clara woke to the smell of damp wood and smoke, her shoulders stiff from the thin mattress and her throat dry from breathing warm air all night. For a moment, she forgot where she was, the strange silence making her heart beat faster, until the faint sound of boots scraping outside reminded her. She was still at the edge of the mountains, still alive, and not in the cell she half expected to wake in after her exile. She pulled on her shawl and moved toward the fire. It had burned down to a red glow. She fed it with kindling and watched the flames catch. The cabin around her came into shape. Rough walls, a low ceiling, the same 2 chairs from last night, and the same air of use that came from a man living alone too long. Everything was neat, practical, but lonely in a way that hung over every object. She found a small tin of coffee on the shelf and set the pot to boil. The act steadied her. She didn't know what rules she lived under here. Was she a guest? A worker? A prisoner? The council's letter said she was to assist Mr. Boone with house duties and general upkeep, but that could mean anything. She decided she would wait and see how the man behaved in daylight, when words could not hide behind firelight. The door opened and a cold wind swept through, bringing the smell of pine and snowmelt. Elias Boone stepped inside, carrying a bundle of split wood under one arm. His coat was heavy with frost, his beard flecked with ice. He set the wood down by the hearth, took off his gloves, and glanced at her only once. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep much," she answered. The wind made the roof sound like someone walking. He looked up at the ceiling, then back at her. "It holds. You'll get used to it." The coffee was ready. She poured 2 cups without asking. He took one, sat at the table, and drank. They stayed quiet for several minutes, the only sound the ticking of the stove as it heated. Clara felt the silence pressing between them, but not in a cruel way. It was the kind of silence that waited for someone to define it. She decided to break it. "Do you really need someone to keep this place?" Elias looked into his cup before answering. "Need? Maybe not, but things wear down faster when you're alone." He gestured to the patched roof and the mended door. "I fix what I can. Still, the cabin always wants more than one man's hands can give." "What did they tell you about me?" she asked. "That you'd lost your husband, that you had nowhere to go, that you could work hard and stay quiet. Did they tell you why I had nowhere to go?" He looked at her for the first time, really looked. His eyes were pale gray, steady but not cold. "They said people talk too much. I don't listen to talk." Her shoulders eased a little. That was more mercy than she'd heard in months. He finished his coffee and stood. "If you're staying, there's work to do. I'll take the ridge for trap lines. You can check the chinking on the north wall. Wind cuts through bad there." She nodded. "I can fix it." He moved to the door, paused, and said, "Don't go past the stream. The ground there gives after thaw." Then he left, shutting the door behind him. When she was alone, Clara walked through the cabin and took stock. The supplies were low: flour, salt, beans, jerky, and coffee. Enough for a few weeks, if careful. The tools were well kept: saw, hammer, knife, sharpening stone. A soldier's sense of order lingered in the way he arranged them. She wondered what kind of man he had been before the mountains took him. She patched the wall with clay and straw, humming without thinking, the same tune she used to hum when her husband was drunk and she needed to remind herself the night would end. Her hands worked faster than her mind. By midday, the cold drafts had softened, and for the first time, she felt useful instead of tolerated. When Elias returned in the afternoon, snow clung to his boots and a pelt hung from his shoulder. He looked around, testing the air. "Feels warmer," he said. "I seal the north side," she replied. "Wind doesn't cut through anymore." He gave a small nod, almost a smile, but not quite. "Good work." That night they shared supper again: beans, coffee, a scrap of dried meat cut in half. This time he asked if she'd been married long. She said 8 years and left it there. He didn't press, but after a while he said, "I had a wife once. A daughter too." The way he said it, plain, without drama, made her look up. "What happened?" "Fever. On the plains. Couldn't get help in time." "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded slightly. It was a long time ago. She didn't believe him. The way he stared at the fire told her the time hadn't passed the way he claimed. The hurt was still there, just buried deep under the habits of survival. They sat like that a long while, two people who had lost more than they could ever explain to anyone else. When she finally stood to wash the dishes, he said, "You can stay here as long as you need. I don't expect talk or thanks. Just honesty." She met his eyes and said, "That's fair." Later, when he banked the fire and she lay down on the cot, she listened to the wind pushing against the shutters and thought of the men who had judged her. None of them would believe she could feel safer in a stranger's cabin than in her own home. Elias sat by the table, the firelight moving over his face. He didn't trust easily. The woman had arrived as another task to manage, a mouth to feed, a promise to the town. But watching her work, quiet and steady, had unsettled something he thought long gone. He saw in her the same determination he'd once seen in the mirror after the war, when survival depended on waking up and doing the next thing. Before he put out the lamp, he looked once more at the cot. She was asleep, one arm tucked under her head, the firelight turning her face soft in the half-dark. He realized then that the cabin no longer sounded empty. When the last ember dimmed, he thought, not with hope, but with a simple clarity, that maybe both of them had come here for the same reason: to be left alone and to find out what being alive still meant after the noise of loss was gone. Snow started falling again 2 days after the thaw began to retreat. At first it came in thin veils across the ridge, soft enough to look harmless. Then the wind rose and brought it down hard, dense, fast, and loud against the cabin roof. Elias had gone out before daylight to check his traps along the stream, saying he'd be back by noon. Clara had watched him disappear between the trees, his figure swallowed by white air, and a worry she didn't want to name had followed him long after. By mid-afternoon, the wind was strong enough to move the door latch. She pushed extra wood into the fire and stood by the window, trying to catch sight of him through the gray. The forest was gone behind the snow curtain, the yard covered in drifts that erased the path. The fear that he might have fallen or lost his way pushed hard in her chest, but she told herself he knew these mountains better than any man alive. Still, when the door finally swung open near dusk, and he stumbled in with a bundle of wet pelts over his shoulder, she let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. He didn't speak. He set the pelts down, unhooked his coat, and leaned against the wall for a moment before crossing to the fire. His face was gray under the beard, his lips cracked and dry. Clara poured him coffee and saw his hand shake when he reached for it. "You're cold through," she said. He didn't answer, only nodded once. He tried to eat the stew she kept warm, but the spoon clattered from his fingers halfway through. She caught it before it hit the table. His eyes blinked slow and unfocused. "Elias," she said, "when did you last sleep?" He pressed his fingers to his temple. "Yesterday, I think. Lost a snare, went too far upriver. You're burning up." She reached for his forehead and felt the heat pulsing through his skin. "You've got a fever." He tried to stand. "I'll walk it off. You'll die out there." Her voice stopped him. He looked at her, confused by her tone, steady, certain, the way people speak when they've already decided what must be done. He let her push him down into the chair near the fire. She found a pan, filled it with water from the bucket, and set it on the stove. The air filled with the hiss of heat meeting cold. She searched the shelf until she found the pouch of herbs she'd brought with her. Willow bark for pain, wild mint for breath. The mixture turned the water bitter, but he drank it without complaint. Hours passed. The storm hammered the walls until the boards creaked like old bones. Elias drifted in and out, sometimes muttering names, Sarah, maybe Anna, and she realized they were the names of the wife and child he'd spoken of. Each time he stirred, she wiped his face and wrists with a wet cloth, trying to keep him anchored in the room, away from whatever ghosts waited in his fever. At some point, he gripped her wrist hard enough to startle her. His voice came rough and low. "Don't go," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." His hand loosened. The tension left his face. She sat beside him until his breathing steadied again. The fire dimmed, then she fed it another log. The heat wrapped the cabin like a blanket, but exhaustion began to pull her under too. She fought it, afraid that if she slept, he might slip away. Near dawn, the storm broke. The silence that followed was heavy but calm. She opened the door just enough to see the world outside. A deep white stillness, the trees bent under the weight of snow. When she closed it again, Elias was stirring. His eyes were clearer. "You kept it warm," he said quietly. She smiled a little. "I told you I could keep a place." He looked at her for a long moment, his voice hoarse but calm. "You could have left. No one would have blamed you." "Maybe not," she said, "but no one would have thanked me either." He watched her move about the cabin, pouring coffee, shaking out blankets, putting the world back in order. For the first time since she arrived, he saw not a woman sent to him out of pity or punishment, but someone who met hardship the way he did, by working through it. Later that morning, when the wind was only a whisper, he tried to stand again and managed it. He was unsteady, but alive. "You'll need rest," she said. "I'll mend the snare tomorrow." She looked up from where she was folding a blanket. "Tomorrow can wait." The words settled in the quiet space between them. He sat back down and didn't argue. That night, the storm's echo faded, and the air inside the cabin felt changed. It wasn't just survival anymore. Something had shifted, small but real. They didn't speak of it, but both of them felt it. When she banked the fire and turned toward her cot, Elias said, "You saved my life." She paused. "We save each other's, I think." Neither said more. Outside, the snow began to slide off the roof in slow, heavy sheets, and the sound of it falling filled the night like a quiet exhale. The snow outside began to melt slowly, leaving dark patches of ground where the sun broke through the clouds. Days passed in quiet rhythm. Elias cutting firewood, Clara tending the fire, the two of them learning each other's movements in silence. The air inside the cabin had changed since the storm. It no longer felt like a place of exile or punishment, but something steadier, though neither dared to call it home. Elias's fever had left him weak for several days. Clara watched him move through the room, his steps slow but deliberate. He tried to pretend he was back to full strength, but his shoulders sagged when he thought she wasn't looking. She didn't point it out. Instead, she filled his cup before he could ask and repaired the coat he had torn near the shoulder. She had learned that help offered quietly was the kind he would accept. He spoke more now. Not much, but more than before. Simple questions. Did the wind come through last night? Or, "You sleep any better?" But even that meant something. For the first time, she heard warmth in his voice when he said her name. One afternoon, while she was mending the curtain by the window, he set aside the trap he had been fixing and said, "There's a thing you should know. About me." She turned, needle paused between stitches. "All right." He took a slow breath. "I wasn't always up here alone. I had a wife once. Her name was Sarah. We had a daughter, Anna. When the war came, I rode with the cavalry. Promised I'd come back before winter." He stopped, rubbed his hand over his face. "I came back 2 years later." The fever had already taken them both. The silence that followed was sharp and clean. Clara didn't fill it. She just waited. "I tried staying in town after," he continued. "Couldn't stand the way people looked at me. Some with pity, some with questions I couldn't answer. So I sold what I'd left, built this place and stayed. Thought the quiet would fix what was broken. He gave a short, humorless laugh. It didn't. Clara laid the needle aside. You were trying to live. That's not nothing. He looked at her across the fire. What about you? What sent you here, really? She hesitated. It wasn't a story she liked to tell, but she knew the question had been waiting between them since the day she arrived. My husband, Thomas, she said finally. He drank, worked little, hit more. The town saw it, but they called it a marriage, so it wasn't their concern. When he fell from the wagon that night, they said it was my curse that did it. Elias's brow tightened. You mean they blamed you because it was easier than facing him for what he was? She nodded. Yes. They wanted a reason that fit their rules. A woman like me, quiet, alone, too much, fit it well. He didn't speak right away. Then, in a steady voice, he said, You don't owe them a thing. I know, but it's strange how blame follows you even when you stop listening to it. They sat without words for a while, the fire giving shape to their thoughts. Outside, the snowmelt dripped from the eaves in slow, steady beats. Later that night, when she brought in wood for the stove, she found him fixing the door latch that had stuck since her first day there. I thought you were resting, she said. He glanced at her, the faintest smile in his eyes. You fixed the walls, I fixed the doors. Fair trade. She wanted to thank him, but instead she said, It'll make the nights quieter. That's the idea. The following morning brought a clear sky, the first real warmth of spring beginning to show. Elias walked with her to the stream. The snow along its banks had broken into soft mounds, the water moving faster now. He pointed toward the ridge. Beyond that line of trees, there's a meadow. Wild onions grow there come summer. Sarah used to pick them. He stopped himself, realizing he had said her name out loud. Clara didn't flinch or look away. She only asked, You still go there? He shook his head. No reason to. Maybe you do now, she said, her tone even. Places like that don't belong to ghosts forever. He didn't answer, but he looked at her differently after that, as if the idea unsettled something he had let stay buried too long. That evening, they ate together again. He told her about the winters when the wolves came close, about the time he lost 3 goats to a cougar and spent a week tracking it before realizing he didn't need revenge. She told him about her father's farm before marriage, the sound of crickets in the wheat fields, how she missed the noise of people but not the cruelty that came with it. The night drew on. The fire burned low. When she stood to put away the dishes, he reached out without thinking and caught her wrist gently. She stopped. His hand was rough, the warmth of it firm but uncertain. He let go almost immediately. Sorry, he said quietly. It's all right, she replied. You didn't hurt me. He nodded, eyes fixed on the fire. Been a long time since anyone's been near enough to touch. She understood. Same for me. They didn't speak again that night, but something wordless settled between them, an understanding that neither was just surviving anymore. When she finally lay down, she watched the firelight move across the beams and thought of how far she had come from the woman they called cursed. For the first time in years, she didn't feel unwanted. She didn't feel afraid. Elias stayed awake longer. He wrote in his small ledger the date, the weather, the repairs they'd made. Then, under the neat lines of numbers, he wrote 4 words he hadn't planned to. The cabin feels alive again. He closed the book, banked the fire, and listened to the quiet. The same silence that once hollowed him out now sounded like company. And as the night settled over the valley, both of them, in their separate corners, felt the same steady truth forming between them. Something built not by words, but by the simple act of staying. By early spring, the snow had thinned to muddy streaks between the trees, and the sound of running water replaced the silence that had ruled all winter. The days grew longer. Smoke no longer rose constantly from the chimney, and the cabin began to breathe again. Clara spent mornings airing blankets and washing the heavy smell of smoke from them, while Elias mended the fence line where frost had split the rails. They worked in rhythm without speaking much, but the quiet between them now felt steady, not strained. The valley looked new. Patches of green pushed through the thawing earth, and the creek ran fast enough that its sound filled the yard. Elias noticed Clara hum sometimes while she worked, low, tuneless, just sound, and realized how strange it felt to have music back in the house, even if it wasn't meant to be music. He didn't mention it. He didn't want her to stop. One morning, he found her outside near the goat pen, kneeling to tie back a broken gate hinge. She had rolled her sleeves to her elbows, and her hands were covered in mud. He watched her for a moment, then said, "That hinge won't hold long." She stood and wiped her hands. "Then we'll fix it again when it breaks." It was a small thing to say, but it stayed with him. They were both people used to things breaking and used to fixing them quietly. That afternoon, the sound of wagon wheels broke the calm. Clara froze, hammer in hand, and looked toward the trail. Elias stepped beside her. The wagon came slowly through the mud, two horses pulling a load, the wheels squealing in protest. The sight of it made her stomach tighten. No one came up this far unless they had a reason. When it stopped in a yard, two men climbed down, faces familiar, though not friendly. They were from the settlement. Elias recognized one as the blacksmith's brother, a man who had once tried to sell him a lame horse at double its worth. The other was the town clerk, thin and red-eyed from too much drink and not enough rest. Elias said nothing. He waited. Afternoon, the clerk started, looking around the yard as if measuring what could be taken or claimed. "We've come for the widow, Clara Vance. The council sent us." Clara's hands tightened on the hammer. Elias stepped forward, the cold edge in his voice returning. "For what reason?" "She's under order, Boone," the man said. "Temporary placement, that's all. Town says her time's up. We'll take her back to face a review." Clara spoke then, her voice clear. "A review for what?" The blacksmith's brother gave a crooked smile. "To see if you've learned your place." Elias's jaw flexed, but he didn't move yet. "You mean to say you came through 3 miles of thawing mud to drag a woman back to a council that didn't want her in the first place?" The clerk shifted uneasily. "We don't decide that, sir. Orders are orders." Elias took a slow step forward until he stood between him and Clara. His shadow stretched across the mud. "You'll turn that wagon around," he said. "Boone, the fine for interference. Try to collect it." The man faltered. Elias didn't raise his voice, but the way he said it carried weight. Years of command hadn't left him completely. Clara stood behind him, her chest tight, watching the scene unfold with a mix of fear and disbelief. For the first time since she'd met him, she saw how dangerous Elias could look when pushed. The blacksmith's brother muttered, "You think she belongs to you now?" Elias's eyes locked on him. "She belongs to herself. That's more than either of you can say." A long silence followed. Wind rustled through the pines. The clerk cleared his throat and said, "We'll report your refusal." "Do that," Elias said. "Tell them I'll be in town, after planting, if they have something worth saying to my face." The men climbed back onto the wagon. The horses turned, wheels digging deep grooves into the wet ground. Neither man looked back. When they were gone, Clara exhaled and set the hammer down. "They won't forget that," she said. "Neither will I," he answered. She gave a half smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You didn't have to speak for me." "Yes," he said, "I did." The rest of the day passed in silence. Elias worked until dark, repairing the fence with more force than needed. Clara cooked stew and left a bowl by his chair. When he came in, his hands were scraped raw, but his eyes had softened. He sat down, ate in silence, then said, "They won't bother you again." "You sound sure." "I am. A man who makes trouble on the mountain doesn't last long." She studied him for a moment. "You risked a lot for someone you barely know." "I know enough," he said simply. She didn't press. Some things didn't need explaining. That night, as the fire burned low, Elias opened his ledger again and added a new note. Visitors came. "Try to take her back." She stayed. Then he closed the book and sat with his elbows on his knees, staring into the coals. Across the room, Clara was sewing a torn sleeve, the light from the fire catching her face in warm flashes. The thought crossed his mind that he had not heard her laugh yet, not once. He wondered what it would sound like. Clara, meanwhile, thought of the way he had stepped in front of her without hesitation. No one had done that for her in years. She wasn't sure how to feel about it. Thankful, certainly, but also uneasy, because protection was a kind of closeness, and closeness could turn into something that scared her as much as it comforted her. Before turning in, Elias said, Tomorrow, we'll ride down to the ridge and see if the creek's passable. Might be time to trade for seed." She nodded. "All right." Neither said good night. They didn't need to. When morning came, the track from the wagon had frozen overnight, deep and sharp in the yard. Clara stepped over them on her way to fetch water and looked toward the trail where the men had vanished. For the first time, she didn't feel like someone waiting to be claimed or forgiven. She was simply there, standing on ground that now felt partly hers. And inside the cabin, Elias watched her through the window for a moment before returning to his workbench. He knew the world would keep testing them, just as it had tested everything he'd ever built. But for now, she was still here, and that was enough to call a good day. The next morning broke with a pale sun stretching over the ridge, thin rays glinting off the patches of melting frost. The air still carried winter's edge, but it softened. Clara stepped outside to hang damp clothes near the fence, her breath forming brief ghosts that vanished into the light. From the barn came the measured sound of Elias hammering new boards into the stall wall, each strike sure and even. The world felt steady again after the confrontation with the men from town, but both of them knew it had left something unsettled beneath the calm. Elias didn't speak of the visit, and Clara didn't ask. Yet she caught him glancing at the trail more often, his eyes scanning the distance with a soldier's habit that never quite left him. He had spent years defending empty land and ghost memories. Now, for the first time in a long while, there was something here he didn't want to lose. After breakfast, they prepared for the trip to the ridge to trade. Elias hitched the horse to the small wagon and checked the harness twice. Clara packed flour, pelts, and the spare tools they could barter. She added a few sewn patches and a small tin of soap she had made from leftover ash and fat, something of her own work, though she said nothing of it. The road was soft from thaw and slowed them to a crawl. The sound of the wagon wheels over wet soil mixed with the constant rush of the creek nearby. For hours they rode without much talk, both content to share silence. Now, and then he pointed out where the land changed. That ridge breaks when rain comes heavy, or you can find wild mint near that bend come summer. His voice had lost the clipped caution it once carried. It had grown calm, deliberate, almost gentle. At the trading post, a small wooden building set against a rise of pine, a farmer's wife came out to greet them. She was a stout woman named Ruth who traded dried apples and coffee for hides. She eyed Clara with the kind of curiosity that wasn't unkind but held its own measure of surprise. "Didn't think Boone ever kept company," she said, pouring coffee into a tin cup. Clara answered before Elias could. "He doesn't keep company. We work the same ground." Ruth smiled faintly. "That's company enough, dear." Inside the post, the light was dim and smelled of tobacco and old flour. They traded quietly. 2 sacks of grain, coffee, seed potatoes, and a small iron kettle Ruth insisted on giving Clara for the stew that keeps a man civil. Clara accepted with a polite nod. Elias said little during the exchange, but when they stepped back into the light, he looked at her and said, "You handled that well." "People ask questions because they don't know better," she replied. "It doesn't bother me anymore." He studied her expression and realized it was true. Something in her had changed since the day she'd arrived, a steadiness that wasn't defiance but confidence. The way back took longer. Clouds moved in, heavy and low, and they reached the cabin at dusk. The stream beside the yard shimmered under the faint light, running strong and fast with meltwater. Clara carried the smaller bundles inside, and Elias led the horse to the barn. When he came back, she already had the kettle on the fire and the room warm. Over supper, they talked in short, comfortable sentences, how the seed might take, whether the goats would breed, how much would to cut before summer storms. Their lives had settled into a rhythm made of simple questions and quiet answers. Later, as she set the dishes aside, Elias said, "You ever think about going back?" Clara looked up, confused. "To the town?" He nodded. She shook her head. "There's nothing waiting for me there. Not even anger anymore. Just absence." He seemed to consider that. "They'll come again, maybe," he said. "Not soon, but men like that don't like being refused." "I know," she said softly, "but they won't find me the same woman they sent away." He gave a small nod, his eyes meeting hers across the firelight. No, they won't. For a while, they sat listening to the night sounds. The creek's low voice, the wood popping in the fire, the soft whine of wind through the gaps in the walls. Elias leaned back in his chair, watching the light move across the floorboards. You ever think about what's next? He asked finally. What do you mean? After the planting. After the thaw. After all this just being about getting through winter. Clara thought for a moment. Maybe a garden. I'd like to see something grow that doesn't have to fight to stay alive. He smiled slightly. That'd be a change. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been waiting since that night of the storm. When you called for them, the names you said, Sarah and Anna, do you still see them? He didn't answer right away. His voice came low. Sometimes. In dreams, mostly. It's like they're waiting just outside the door. I stopped opening it years ago. She nodded, not pitying him, but understanding. Maybe that's all grief really is, learning not to open that door every day. He looked at her then, long and steady. You talk like someone who's done that a few times. I have. He wanted to ask about the husband again, but the look in her eyes stopped him. Some stories were better left in the quiet until their edges dulled. Before sleep, he checked the door latch as he always did, then paused near her cot. You made this place different, he said. I don't know how, but you did. She met his eyes and said simply, so did you. Outside, the wind turned warm for the first time that year, carrying the scent of wet pine and soil. Spring had come for real now, not the kind that teased and vanished, but the kind that stayed. The next morning, when the light poured through the window and the air smelled of thaw and life, Clara stepped outside barefoot, feeling the cold mud under her feet, and smiled to herself. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a guest in the world. She felt part of it, like the land had made room for her again. Elias watched her from the porch, his hands resting on the railing. She looked back at him once, the faintest nod between them, and then went on tending to her chores. Neither spoke, but both knew it. The exile was over. What came next wasn't survival anymore. It was living. By midsummer, the valley had changed color. The grass rose in tall, soft waves, and the stream ran clear again after months of silt and thaw. The air was thick with heat and insects, and every night the sound of crickets filled the silence that winter had once owned. Life at the cabin had taken on a rhythm that no longer felt temporary. The two of them had built fences, planted a small garden, and learned the balance of the land and each other. The goats were fat and healthy. The potatoes had begun to show green shoots. It was a life that belonged to both of them now, though neither had said it aloud. But the quiet never stayed untouched for long. One morning, Elias returned from checking traps to find a boy waiting at the edge of the yard, a scrawny teenager on a thin bay horse, dust covering his face. The boy held a folded letter. From a council, he said. Told me to bring it quick. Elias took the envelope without a word and gave the boy water. Clara watched from the porch, her hands still from where she'd been shelling beans. The boy drank, nodded, and rode back the way he'd come. Elias stood for a long time with the letter unopened, the crease of it pressed against his thumb. When he finally read it, his jaw tightened. They want a hearing, he said. Clara stood. For me? For us, he replied. Says here the town intends to settle the matter of your exile and my refusal to comply. We're to appear within the week. Her stomach turned cold, the way it had the day she was cast out. And if we don't, they'll come again, he said simply. For a moment, neither spoke. The sun burned high above the ridge, turning the air sharp and dry. Clara turned back toward the cabin. Then we go, she said. He looked at her, surprised. You sure about that? She nodded. If they want to see who I am now, let them. I won't live hiding from ghosts. Elias stared at her, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. All right then, we'll go. They spent the next 2 days preparing the wagon. Clara packed bread, water, and clean clothes. Elias cleaned his rifle, but left it unloaded, an old habit, not a threat. On the morning they left, the cabin looked almost too peaceful, the kind of place that could make a person believe the world was simple. Clara looked back at it as they rode down the trail, wondering if it would still feel like home when they returned. The town looked smaller than she remembered, yet meaner somehow. Faces turned when they arrived, whispering names under their breath. The council waited in front of the church, a line of men in clean coats pretending not to notice how they were stared at. The same men who had exiled her now sat ready to measure her again. The head councilman, an older man with a trimmed beard and a voice that carried too easily, opened the hearing. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "your exile was set for 1 year, conditional on your good behavior and the supervision of Mr. Boone. We've received complaints of noncompliance." Elias's voice cut through the murmurs. "You mean we didn't obey an order that never had the right to be given?" The councilman frowned. "You harbor a woman accused of neglecting her duties as wife and citizen." Clara stepped forward. "Accused, not proven. I lived with a man who broke bones and faith in equal measure, and you called it marriage because it kept your church comfortable. You sent me away to make yourselves clean." A murmur ran through the crowd. A few women lowered their eyes, but not out of disapproval, out of understanding. The councilman cleared his throat. "You were given refuge, not independence." "I was given a choice," she said, her voice steady now. "And I made it." Elias looked at the faces before him. Men who had once served under commanders, obeyed orders, judged strangers by convenience. He stepped beside her. "You can write whatever you like in your books," he said, "but she stays where she chooses. She's done more honest work in that cabin than any of you have seen in a lifetime of talking." The older man glared. "You risk fine and penalty, Boone." Elias shrugged. "You already took everything that mattered. What's left to find?" For a long moment, no one spoke. The tension hung thick, then broke when the clerk whispered something to the headman. The council stepped aside to confer in low voices, leaving the two of them standing under the hot noon sun. When they returned, the headman's tone had changed. "Mrs. Vance, your exile is hereby lifted. You may reside where you wish. Mr. Boone, your defiance will be recorded, but not punished, as the matter is closed." Clara blinked, the words landing slower than they should have. That's it," the man said, already turning away. It was over. Not dramatic, not righteous, just done. They left town in silence, the wagon creaking beneath them. Dust rose behind the wheels, and neither looked back. When the valley came into view again, the sound of the stream met them like an old friend. Clara's shoulders loosened for the first time in days. "It feels different," she said. Elias looked at her. "What does?" "Coming home," she said. He didn't answer, but the faint smile on his face said enough. When they reached the cabin, the evening light washed over the roof and the field beyond. Clara climbed down from the wagon and stood for a long moment, watching smoke curl from the chimney where she had left a small fire burning. The place no longer looked like exile or shelter. It looked like theirs. That night, after supper, Elias stood with her near the small cairn they had built months before. The air was warm, filled with the smell of pine and earth. He turned toward her, his voice quiet but certain. "You can stay here as long as you want," he said. Then, after a pause, or longer, she looked up at him. "You mean marry?" He nodded once. "If you'll have it." She didn't answer with words. She reached for his hand and held it tight. "I already stayed," she said. The ceremony happened 2 days later in the yard by the stream. Ruth and her husband came from the trading post to witness it, simple and unspoken. Elias wore a clean shirt. Clara wore the shawl she'd arrived in, washed and mended. When it was done, Ruth hugged her and said, "You're home now." The summer passed in quiet work. They harvested early greens from the garden, fixed the roof, and built a small shed behind the cabin. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes not. One evening, as the sky turned red above the ridge, Elias took his ledger and drew a clean line under the old entries. Below it he wrote, "July 2nd, Clara and I build our life today." He closed the book and left it open on the table, as if the cabin itself needed to remember. Clara joined him at the door, watching the valley fade into dusk. "Do you ever think about what's next?" she asked. He nodded. "Every day, but I don't look far. This," he gestured to the cabin, "the land, and her, is enough." She leaned against his shoulder. "Then we're even." As night fell, the sound of the creek drifted through the open window. The firelight moved across their faces, and for the first time, there were no ghosts left between them. The past had not been erased, but had found its place behind them, not inside them. When the stars came out, Clara looked toward the ridge and thought of the woman who had once been exiled, the one who had arrived here half frozen and afraid. That woman was gone now, buried somewhere between the cabin walls and the stream. In her place stood someone who had built a life with her own hands. Elias reached over and took her hand again. "You're home," he said quietly. "I know," she whispered. And with that, the story that began with exile ended not in rescue, but in the simple, solid peace of staying. Two people who have been broken by the world finding out that love, when it's real, doesn't need to be spoken loud. It only needs to last.